Welcome to Sola Church Online.
I'm Alan Rigg. This is my wife, Miranda Landers, and together we lead Sola Church, a life-giving church in Santa Monica, California.
We meet in person on Sundays at 10 a.m. inside Joslyn Park Auditorium, 633 Kensington Road.
And we pre-record parts of our service to share with you guys here online.
And we have a great service for you today. Let's worship.
Sits on heaven's mercy seat. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. With all creation I sing praise to the King of Kings. You are my everything, and I will adore you. I will adore you. Clothed in rainbows of living color, flashes of lightning, roars of thunder. Blessing and power, strength and glory and power be to you, the only wise King. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. With all creation I sing praise to the King of Kings. You are my everything, and I will adore you. Filled with wonder, awestruck wonder at the mention of your name. Jesus, your name is power, breath and living water, such a marvelous mystery. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. With all creation I sing praise to the King of Kings. You are my everything, and I will adore you. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, Grace is an ocean we're all singing, and heaven meets earth like an unforeseen kiss, and my heart beats violently inside of my chest, and I don't have the time to maintain these regrets when I think about the way He loves us. Oh, how He loves us. Oh, how He loves us. Oh, how He loves us. He loves us. Oh, how He loves us. Oh, how He loves us. Oh, how
This is that time in our service when we worship with our giving. If you're just checking us out, please don't feel obligated to give. But if Sola Church is your church home, or you just want to help us accomplish our mission to be a life-giving church here on the west side of Los Angeles, it's super easy to make a one-time tax-deductible donation or even to schedule a recurring gift.
The easiest way is to look for the link in your chat feed, but you can also go to solachurch.life and look for the tab at the top that says Give.
While we have a moment, thought I'd remind everyone that we do meet inside at Joslyn Park Auditorium, but there are a couple weeks coming up where that space inside is unavailable. The first 2 Sundays in November, I think that's the 6th and the 13th, they're going to be using that space for voting, which is awesome. So those 2 Sundays, we'll still be at Joslyn Park. We'll simply move right outside. Instead of being inside the auditorium, we'll do a family service outside in the park like we did for much of the summer. It'll be super fun. The weather's changed here. We've got fall-like weather now. It's going to be really, really nice.
We've actually all really enjoyed our outside services.
It's been fun, right?
Yes, it has. And today we are talking about end times, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I'm just going to tell everybody up front, I've got a real challenge here because I'm taking about 90 minutes worth of content, and my goal was to condense that to about 30 minutes, and I think maybe it's going to be more like 45, which is still pretty good considering.
It goes so fast, though. I mean, such an interesting topic.
It is an interesting topic, so just know that, it was a little bit challenging trying to pare it down, but I hope you enjoy it.
Let's get into our time of teaching.
So you may have seen the bumper sticker that says, Jesus is coming. How about the one that says, Jesus is coming, look busy? Ever seen that one? How about this one? I saw this one. Jesus is coming, and boy is he pissed. Oh man. Bumper sticker theology aside, every generation of Christ followers has wondered if it might be the last. From those who are curious to those who are concerned. We have questions like, what's going to happen and when? Does the Bible tell us what to do? How about what not to? That's what we're talking about today. Let's turn in the Bible to Mark chapter 13. This is part of a message series called Convergence, a verse-by-verse study through the gospel according to Mark. Convergence is when 2 or more things come together. On the pages of Mark's gospel, we see eternity come together with time, heaven with earth, God with man. And we see that not just on these pages, but in this place, this online space. So glad that you're watching today. The title of this message is The End. We want to talk about what not to do and what to do as we get nearer to the end as described by Jesus. So check it out, Mark 13, beginning in verse 1. It says, Then as he went out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, Teacher, see what manner of stones and what buildings are here. And Jesus answered and said to him, Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down. So remember, this is Tuesday of Holy Week. and they're having this conversation about the temple. Josephus, the Jewish historian, described it this way: the exterior of the temple was covered with massive plates of gold, which brilliantly reflected the sun. From a distance, it appeared like a snow-covered mountain, since whatever was not plated with gold was of purest white. So they're having this conversation when Jesus drops a bombshell. A couple days before this, he described the destruction of Jerusalem. Now he describes the destruction of the temple. So picking it up in verse 3, now as he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when all these things will be fulfilled?" So, they left the temple, they crossed the Kidron Valley, they ascended the Mount of Olives, and here they are on the side of the Mount of Olives from which they can see the temple. And so these two pair of brothers, Peter and Andrew, brothers, James and John, brothers, wanted to continue this conversation. And they actually asked Jesus 3 questions. Matthew's version gives us the most detailed quote of what it was they asked. Here's what they asked. Number 1, when will these things be? That is, the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. Number 2, what will be the sign of your coming? And number 3, of the end of the age. So only Luke answers the first question, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke all detail Jesus' answer to questions 2 and 3, which are really the same question. What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Now, let me just create a little bit of a timeline. When it comes to the end times, when it comes to the end, Christians agree about one thing, and that is that Jesus is coming. We call that the second coming. Christians agree about little else. There are lots of different ideas about everything else about the end. So I'm coming from a stream that is called premillennial and pre-tribulational. We can disagree about this and be friends, but let me lay out the timeline as I understand it so that you'll be able to contextualize the things that I'm going to talk about. So as I understand it, on a timeline, here we might place the second coming. So the 7 years before that, we sometimes call the tribulation. And we'll learn more about that in this message. Sometime just before the tribulation begins is an event called the rapture. So in the rapture, people who've trusted Jesus to forgive them and lead them, we might call them the church, the universal church, the invisible church, they are taken to be with the Lord. And soon after that, this tribulation period begins. At the end of the 7 years, the tribulation ends with the second coming of Christ, after which there is a 1,000-year kingdom here on earth. We call that the millennium, since it lasts 1,000 years. And after the millennium, the creation of a new heaven and a new earth. So I've left lots of stuff out. Again, there is no universal agreement about this timeline. Not even saying that I'm right, just saying that this is how I understand it. And hopefully, as I talk about things, you'll be able to place them on that timeline. So there is a difference between the second coming of Christ and the rapture of the church. One of the reasons that I believe in this event called the rapture is because of these differences. In the second coming, Christ comes to the earth, whereas in the rapture, Christ comes in the air. In the second coming, Christ comes with the church. In the rapture, Christ comes for the church. In the second coming, Christ comes openly. In the rapture, Christ comes secretly. In the second coming, there are very specific signs that the second coming is about to happen. We're going to talk about those today. With regard to the rapture, there are no signs, meaning simply that nothing has to happen before the rapture can happen. So keep in mind that Jesus did not mention the rapture in Mark 13. This is what we call the Olivet Discourse. It has nothing to do with the rapture or the church. It has everything to do with the second coming and with Israel. If Jesus ever mentioned the rapture, it was a couple days later in what we call the Upper Room Discourse. But as Jesus talks in this passage about the signs that the second coming is near, that we're near the end, how much closer then is the rapture? At least 7 years, right? So let's talk about first what not to do. The first thing that we're told not to do when it comes to the end is do not be deceived. Let's pick it up at verse 5. And Jesus answering them began to say, take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name saying, I am he, and will deceive many. So the first sign that Jesus gives is that of false Christs. And granted, that's nothing new. There were false Christs before and during the time of Jesus. And of course, there have been many since. But here's something important to understand about all of the general signs in this first section. In Mark 13, verse 8, when we get there, you'll notice at the end of that verse, you can look at it now if you want to, Jesus said about these general signs that he starts with, these are the beginnings of sorrows. So the Greek noun translated of sorrows refers to labor pains, which of course are rhythmic pains of increasing severity and frequency. That's the operative phrase. These general signs that Jesus gives are things that will always have been true, but things that near the end will increase dramatically in severity and frequency. A Syracuse University professor who researched the contemporary religious situation in America determined that there are more than 2,000 practicing gurus, that's the word he used, calling themselves Christ. So is this increasing in frequency and intensity? I can't say. But you might be surprised to learn that there are that many people claiming to be the Christ. And of course, if you've heard any talk at all about the end, you know that eventually there will be a figure known as the Antichrist. Have you seen that movie, The Omen? You know, they actually remade the original movie, but in the story, an American ambassador learns to his horror that his son is actually the literal Antichrist. It was interesting when they did the remake and they were, putting out the casting call. There was one mother who was quoted as saying, my son would be great for this role. And I thought, wow, like who sees a casting call for, quote, the world's creepiest boy, end quote, and immediately thinks, that's my kid. Well, this figure, the Antichrist, during the tribulation, the 7 years leading up to the second coming, will be the leader of a global government and will be the object of worship for a global religion. Anti in Antichrist means in place of, not against. So what we should understand is that the Antichrist is a counterfeit Christ, the ultimate counterfeit Christ. And he will be received by people of all faiths as being this messianic figure. So we live in a time, where in this postmodern world with its emphasis on syncretism, we certainly, are fertile ground for this sort of thing. And that's why as Christians, in terms of, again, what is it that we're to do as we get nearer to the end? Do not be deceived. Well, we need to know what we believe and why. We need to read and reflect on the Bible. And that's one reason why God has given us the church and why God has given us gifted pastors and teachers, is to help us with that. So what not to do, do not be deceived. Here's another thing that we're told not to do near the end. Do not be afraid. Verse 7, but when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be troubled. For such things must happen, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. So the second sign is war. Now again, war is nothing new, but don't forget the operative phrase, increasing severity and frequency. When we talk about the 20th century, we call it the century of war. Between World War I and World War II, there were some 77 million deaths, military and civilian combined. And of course, that includes the estimated 12 million lives lost in the Holocaust. But even as I am pre-taping this teaching segment for our online service, there is what's called the Doomsday Clock. Maybe you've heard of it. You can check it out online. It's thebulletin.org. But since 1947, a group of scientists have moved the minute hand on the so-called Doomsday Clock as a symbol of nuclear danger. The clock's original setting in 1947 was 7 minutes to midnight. And since then, it's been set backward 8 times and forward 16 times for a total of 24 changes. The farthest from midnight it's ever been was 17 minutes in 1991. The nearest it's ever been is 100 seconds. That's where it is right now. That's where they've had it since 2020. It actually says on their website that with regard to the possibility of, a nuclear disaster, that we are at doom's doorstep, quote unquote. And of course, if you're watching the news, you hear Putin's saber rattling, unwilling to say that tactical nuclear weapons are off the table in Ukraine. And you've heard President Biden's recent warning that kind of talk puts us in the greatest danger of Armageddon since the Cuban Missile Crisis of the 60s. And so with all of that out there, certainly we know that we do live in a dangerous world and that these are dangerous times. I'll just mention in passing that in Ezekiel chapter 38, it describes a Russian invasion of Israel. And it indicates that Russia will be accompanied by a group of Muslim nations. And so, we would, on a timeline, the timeline that we created, that would be most likely to happen just before or just after the rapture. It wouldn't have to happen before the rapture, but it could. And it's just interesting because on the one hand, you have, Russia being aggressive now in a way that makes you wonder how far they might have considered going. But on the other hand, you have their humiliation in Ukraine. And now when we read that Israel will defeat them, in that prophecy, it says that Israel will defeat them. I mean, used to describe that as a miracle, as divine intervention. Now I'm not so sure that Russia wouldn't just beat them. But be that as it may, there is reason for us to be afraid when we hear about, war and the rumors of war, as it talks about. But Jesus says what? He says, do not be afraid. I love that. Why not? Because God is in control. Because history is, as they say, his story. And I think that's another reason God gave us the church. When we live in trying times, we need each other. We need the comfort that comes from doing life together, from being part of a community, in this case, a community of faith. So what not to do as the end draws near? Well, do not be deceived, but also do not be afraid. And then third, do not worry. Verse 8, there will be earthquakes in various places, and there will be famines and troubles. These are the beginnings of sorrows. Jesus is going to give several more signs as part of this do not worry command. But so the third sign that we've gotten so far is here at the beginning of verse 8, and it is earthquakes. Again, nothing new, but again, the operative phrase, increasing severity and frequency. So if you go to the U.S. Geological Survey website, in their frequently asked questions section, they actually answer the question, are earthquakes increasing? And their answer is no. It says there, earthquakes of magnitude 7.0 or greater have remained fairly constant throughout this century. However, I would point out that the National Earthquake Information Center locates about 20,000 earthquakes each year, or approximately 50 per day. I remember some years ago, back in the 2000s, there was like a shark scare. And I saw a report from Florida, from a helicopter over the beach. And from the helicopter, you could see all these swimmers in the ocean surrounded by sharks. Their point was, see, we swim around sharks all the time. That so did not help. Oh my goodness. Like I'm watching that thinking, I'm never going in the ocean again. I might stop showering. So, we just had the deadliest earthquake in history in 2004. Actually, I should rephrase that. What I meant to say was that we had an earthquake in 2004 that caused the deadliest tsunami. You guys remember that tsunami that killed approximately 230,000 people, 168,000 in Indonesia alone. It was terrible. But, whatever you think about climate change, obviously people have different ideas about that. It's a little bit hard to deny that we seem to be, seeing more extreme weather. And that's consistent with what Jesus was talking about here. The fourth sign, that would be famines in verse 8. Remember, we just read that. Earthquakes at various places, famines, troubles. So the fourth sign that we've encountered so far is that of famines. And actually the percentage of undernourished people declined from like 1990 to 2014, but it's risen since. And as it is now, 1 in 9 people in the world live with chronic hunger every day. Nearly half of the deaths of children under 5 are linked to poor nutrition. The fifth sign, well, in verse 8 it said troubles, but Matthew and Luke use a more specific word. They use the word pestilences. So there are different ways we could think about this. We could think about biological and chemical weapons, the so-called bugs and gas, always a threat, always a danger. We could think about what we've just lived through together with COVID. Again, another topic that people have different opinions about. I'm not trying to be political or trying to tell anybody what to think about COVID. We lost a friend to COVID, and I'm guessing that some of you watching this service did too. Certainly it's very real to those of us who lost loved ones. And it was an example of how something could spread around the globe rapidly, infecting lots and lots of people. If nothing else, in this context, it makes it easier for us to understand what that could look like in an end time scenario. So as we continue reading in verse 9, but watch out for yourselves, for they will deliver you up to councils, and you will be beaten in the synagogues. You will be brought before rulers and kings for my sake, for a testimony to them. Let's skip verse 10. We'll come back to it. So verse 11, but when they arrest you and deliver you up, do not worry beforehand or premeditate what you will speak, but whatever is given you in that hour, speak that. For it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. Now brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child, and children will rise up against parents and cause them to be put to death. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but he who endures to the end shall be saved. So there at the end of verse 13, when it talks about the person enduring to the end of being saved, it's talking about people during that tribulation period, how survivors will be delivered by the second coming. But in those verses I just read, we see a sixth general sign, and that is the sign of persecution. Again, nothing new. If you've ever read Fox's Book of Martyrs, you know about many of the persecutions that took place very early in church history. But in his foreword to Nina Shea's book, In the Lion's Den, Chuck Colson wrote that more Christians died for their faith in the 20th century than in the previous 19 centuries combined. I was stunned when I read that. That book contains examples of persecution, things like amputation, bombing, crucifixion, displacement, flogging, kidnapping, murder, prison, rape, slavery, and torture. Terrible. I was on an international flight one time and spotted someone across the plane wearing a t-shirt that said, "So many Christians, so few lions." And I was just like, wow. I mean, I wish I could have had a conversation with that person. It wasn't possible for me to get to them. But, you know, we do live in a climate where the tide is turned considerably in terms of how people of faith are perceived and how Christians in particular are treated. But rather than seeing this as an obstacle, Jesus suggests that we should see it as an opportunity. You know, he describes the opportunity that it will provide at the end. But even for us as we approach the end, there are always opportunities in the midst of obstacles. And even persecution presents unique opportunities to stand for our faith and to point people to God. But what does Jesus say about all of this? In verse 11, he says, do not worry. Now, often people of faith like us are criticized for doing nothing. There have been some Christians who, because they believe that, you know, we're near the end, they've given up trying to fight the good fight in the sense of trying to make the world a better place, in the sense of, trying to stand up against injustice and oppression and things like that. While we can't do everything, we can all do something, and we should. And that's another reason that God gave us the church. Think of the good that we can do together. Even when we think about some of these general signs, natural disasters like this hurricane that we just had in Florida, there are churches that are, taking food and clothing, Christian relief organizations that are helping people financially. You think about hunger and the many Christians around the world that are feeding people. Think even about, disease and so forth, and the role that we can play by serving certainly lots of people of faith in the healthcare industry, but even serving as hospice volunteers and things of that nature, participating in, like Race for the Cure, events like that. When it comes to persecution, we just need to pray that God would give us opportunities to share our faith. So verse 10, I said we'd go back and grab it. It says, the gospel must first be preached to all the nations. The gospel must first be preached to all the nations. So a seventh general sign could be a witness, being a witness. And some people, I just need to touch on this quickly before you move on. Some people have made the mistake of thinking that before the rapture of the church can happen, every person in the world has to hear the gospel. That is the good news, or to put it another way, the message about Jesus. And I don't agree with that for a couple of reasons. One, because Jesus is not talking about the rapture, he's talking about the second coming. And in the book of Revelation, we learn that everyone will hear the message about Jesus during the tribulation, before the second coming. In Revelation 7, it describes 144,000 Jewish evangelists who will share the good news. In Revelation 11, it describes 2 witnesses who will share the good news. The book of Revelation also describes angels proclaiming from the heavens the good news. So I think that is how it will be fulfilled before the second coming. And then when we make that applied to the rapture, the other problem with that is that we lose the historical doctrine of imminency. Christians have always had this sense that it could happen at any moment. Well, if the rapture can't happen until every person has heard, then it can't happen at any moment, because not every person has heard yet. So you would lose imminency. Jesus told us what not to do when we found ourselves near the end. Do not be deceived. Do not be afraid. Do not worry. What about what to do? Let's pick it up in verse 14. We've got to take a good bit of text here. It says, "So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing where it ought not, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down into the house, nor enter to take anything out of his house. And let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. And pray that your flight might not be in winter. For in those days there will be tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the creation, which God created until this time, nor ever shall be. And unless the Lord had shortened those days, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, whom he chose, he shortened the days. Then, if anyone says to you, 'Look, here is the Christ,' or 'Look, he is there,' do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will rise and show signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. But take heed. See, I have told you all things beforehand." So, in verses 1 through 13, we had what I've described several times as general signs. So things that have always been true, but things that near the end will increase in severity and frequency. Beginning in verse 14, we get very specific signs. Jesus begins to talk about things here that will happen during the tribulation. In fact, when we talk about that 7 years that we call the tribulation, we sometimes refer to the second half as the Great Tribulation. And there is a pivotal event. It's like the hinge between the first half of the tribulation and the second half, called the Great Tribulation. That event is the abomination of desolation, mentioned in verse 14. Now, it sounds scary, might make a great name for like a death metal band or something. But what we're talking about is a time when the temple in Jerusalem would be desecrated. This event is spoken of at least 3 times by the ancient Hebrew prophet Daniel. It was foreshadowed by Antiochus IV, who desecrated the temple in 167 BC. But according to Jesus, there is a fulfillment that is yet future. Now, the problem, obviously, is that the temple that Jesus and his disciples are looking at and talking about no longer exists. It was destroyed in 70 AD, the second temple, Herod's temple, destroyed in 70 AD. There is no temple there today. But you know, it's interesting to think about how much things have changed in the last century, less than a century, really. I mean, if you go back a century, there is no Israel, much less, the possibility of a temple on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. But in 1948, we have the rebirth of Israel. We have the modern state of Israel established in 1948. And we have them retaking the Temple Mount in 1967. Now, the Temple Mount is the holiest site in Jerusalem, but it is also the 3rd holiest site in Islam. And there on the Temple Mount today, you have the Dome of the Rock Shrine, which was built in the 7th century, as well as the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which was built in the 8th century. The Mount is managed by Muslims. Now, I won't get into great detail, time just won't allow, but there are actually, part of the problem would be that it's commonly believed that the temple was right where the Dome of the Rock shrine is now. The mosque isn't on the spot where the temple was. The mosque is at the other end of the mount. But the shrine is on the spot that the temple likely sat. But there are now a couple of alternate theories about where on the Temple Mount the temple actually sat. There is the work of retired Hebrew University professor Asher Kaufman that would place the original temple in such a way that the shrine would be in the outer court. And then there's also what's called the Southern Hypothesis, using infrared photography, studying the subterranean structures there in the Temple Mount, that would place the temple between the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which again would place the Muslim structures in the outer court. So, if you're interested, you can learn more about that at a website called templemount.org. But I've traveled to Israel many times. I've been in Jerusalem many times. On those visits, I like to go to a place. One of my favorite stops is a place called the Temple Institute. And there at the Temple Institute, they've actually been fabricating the implements for a third Jewish temple for a long time. And again, there's a lot that could be said about this, about those who are actually in training to serve as priests and so forth. There's been a lot of activity in this way over a period of time. And they are ready. They are ready for another temple. So I do believe that that temple will be rebuilt, and that here in the middle of that tribulation period, it will be desecrated. So this abomination in verse 14, well, we get more information about this in Revelation 13. What's going to happen, you have the Antichrist, who, as I said, is not only the leader of a global government, but the object of worship of a global religion. And you have his right-hand man, so to speak, the false prophet. So the false prophet is going to set up an image of the Antichrist in the temple. And here's the crazy part. It describes this inanimate image as becoming animate. Now, how could that happen? I don't know. We don't know the nature of the image. So it makes it a little bit harder to speculate. And speculate is all we can do. What I'm about to say is pure conjecture. So don't take it as anything more than that. But demonic possession could be involved. Could a demon make an inanimate object appear to become animate? What about artificial intelligence? Boy, the rate at which they're developing AI, you wonder if AI could play a role in this. And you can't even rule out something like cloning. If you could clone a human being, the thought is that you would have an animate body, but would that body have a spirit the same way that we do? It could be that a clone could be involved. These are, again, purely conjecture, just interesting to think about. But when this image is set up and when this inanimate thing becomes animate, it's going to be an unmistakable sign. And when that happens, Jesus gives specific instructions to Jews in and around Jerusalem. He says clearly in verse 14, flee to the mountains. And he follows that up by saying, don't stop for anything. Don't even return to your home to get your personal possessions. You need to get out now. So part of what we come to understand as we compare other scriptures is that this 7-year period that we call the tribulation, what officially begins it is not the rapture, which is why I say the rapture would likely happen sometime just before it. But what technically starts it is the Antichrist signing a treaty. So the Antichrist signs this 7-year treaty, but here halfway through he breaks the treaty. And he goes from being Israel's protector to being Israel's persecutor. So flee to the mountains. Where might Jewish people flee? There's been a lot of talk over the years about Petra, the rock city in modern Jordan. And I've been there. It's an amazing sight. It's one of the most incredible things I've ever seen in my travels around the world. It's situated in the Great Rift Valley. It lies between the Dead Sea and the Gulf of Aqaba. And it's famous for its many stone structures that are literally carved into the rock. So all of the structures are in the face of the cliff. They're carved into it. So they have exteriors that are carved into it, and then you can actually enter these spaces inside the cliff. They had certainly what by ancient standards was very sophisticated waterworks, and it was considered to be virtually impenetrable. the entrance, and this is how we got to it, the entrance leads steeply down through a dark, narrow gorge. As I was walking through the entrance, there were times that the gorge was so narrow, I could put my arms out and I could touch either side of it. But if you look straight up, you're looking up, I don't know how many stories, I don't know how many feet it was. It was way, way up, and you could just see this little sliver of blue sky. So you're walking through this narrow gorge. And finally, when you get to the end of it and you step into Petra, the first thing that you see is what's called the treasury. I mean, it was the ancient treasury for this ancient city. And there in the entrance are two eagles. Now, if you've ever seen the movie Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, you've actually seen the exterior of the treasury. It's just plainly in view. You could pull it up on Netflix. I didn't check before recording this to see if that movie is on Netflix, but Netflix, Hulu, HBO Max, chances are you've got access to it somewhere. Go to the end of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade and you'll see the treasury with the two eagles. Now in the movie, when they go inside, obviously you're seeing a studio, but they do use the real exterior. In Revelation 12:14 it says, "But the woman," that is Israel, "was given two wings of a great eagle." Interesting, right? "That she might fly into the wilderness to her place where she is nourished for a time," that's a year, "and times," that is 2 years, "and half a time," that is 6 months, or 3.5 years altogether, "from the presence of the serpent," that is Satan. So could Petra be this mountain hideaway to which Jesus was telling people to go? I don't know. It's possible. It's interesting. It's just fun to talk about. But back in verses 19 and 20, it talked about how the tribulation that will follow will be unlike anything ever in history. And it says that unless God shortened the days, that is, unless Jesus came back, unless Jesus interrupted this, no one would survive. But he says, for the elect's sake, whom he chose, he shortened the days. So we can't get into it now, but if you want to, you can read a little bit about the Great Tribulation. In Revelation 16, we have the 7 bowl judgments, and it describes for us these things that are happening during this time. But just what Jesus says here about how if he didn't interrupt it, no one would survive is probably all we need to know. Now, when it talks about the elect there, in the New Testament, when it talks about the elect, sometimes it's talking about Jews and sometimes it's talking about the church. And the context tells us which. Here, it's clearly a Jewish context. You see the reference to Judea in verse 14. To verse 19, Matthew adds the phrase, or on the Sabbath day, which wouldn't be an issue, obviously, for Gentiles. So remember, I told you that this whole chapter has nothing to do with the rapture or the church and everything to do with the second coming in Israel. So we have to keep that in mind. Now, the interesting thing is that when the abomination of desolation takes place, Revelation 12 verse 6 says that it will be 1,260 days to the second coming. So if you were alive on earth when the abomination of desolation took place, you could start counting the days. And exactly 1,260 days later would be the second coming of Christ. And we read about the second coming in the verses that follow, verse 24. But in those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The stars of heaven will fall and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send his angels and gather together his elect from the four winds, from the farthest part of the earth to the farthest part of heaven. Isaiah 63 verse 1 makes it sound as if when Jesus returns, he will return first to Bozrah in modern Jordan, which interestingly is strategically placed between Megiddo, this valley that will be a staging area for the Battle of Armageddon, and Petra that we've been talking about. Revelation 19 describes Jesus going north to Megiddo, and destroying the armies gathered there. And then Zechariah 14 verse 3 describes Jesus returning to Jerusalem, standing first on the Mount of Olives, the Mount of Olives splitting in two, and then Jesus entering Jerusalem through what's called the Eastern Gate. Now, the Eastern Gate has been closed for years. You can access it from the Temple Mount, which is how I accessed it. I was on one of my trips. I was in Jerusalem. I had a friend with me. We were on the Temple Mount. I mentioned earlier that the Muslims control the Temple Mount, and they actually had an armed guard that, was prohibiting access. He was walking back and forth, prohibiting access to that closed eastern gate. Keep in mind, because we're on the Temple Mount, we're on what would be considered the inside of the gate. But we watched him long enough to know what his pattern was and how much time we would have. And at just the right time, with his back to us, we darted to the eastern gate. We're checking it out. We're standing up on the top and the back side of the eastern gate, looking into the Kidron Valley below and across at the Mount of Olives, and imagining Jesus standing on the Mount of Olives and the mount splitting in two, and imagining, Jesus then entering Jerusalem through that eastern gate. Unbelievable. Isn't that crazy? And you know that long ago, Muslims, understanding this prophecy, desecrated the eastern gate by creating a cemetery right outside of it. They began burying bodies right outside of the eastern gate with the idea that a Jewish Messiah would never, ever cross over a desecrated area like that. I got to tell you, that's not going to keep Jesus from entering through that eastern gate. Well, we did get busted. Eventually, I guess we overstayed, like we stayed a little too long, and that armed guard did end up confronting us. And so when he did confront us, asking us what we were doing or what we were doing there, I just immediately blurted out the name of the next gate. And, he took that to mean that we were lost, like stupid Americans. The gate's that way. So we got away with it. We scoped out the eastern gate. I started to say I highly recommend it, but I don't know, maybe that wasn't the best idea. Maybe that would be the safest thing for you to do. So as it's described, though, we have then the regathering of Israel in verse 27. Remember, in our timeline, we're going to have the millennium, the literal 1,000-year reign of Christ here on earth from Jerusalem. Verse 31 talks about how heaven and earth will pass away, but Revelation 21 and 22 tells us that God will create a whole new heaven and earth. And so you notice that word know in verses 28, 29. The Greek word is gnosko. It means to learn to know, to come to know, to get a knowledge of. So we talked about what not to do near the end, but what to do. What are we to do near the end? The first thing is to be aware. To a certain extent, we need to have our Bible in one hand and our iPhone in the other. We need to know what the Bible says about the end times, like we're doing now. And we need to have some sense of what's happening in the world and how the two go together. In Hebrews 10, verses 24 and 25, there's a verse that we quote oftentimes that talks about not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, but exhorting one another. We usually take this to refer to gathering as a faith community. We take it to refer to a worship gathering in person, or to some extent even online like this. In person is always ideal, but so grateful that we have this technology. But what we often leave out is what comes right after. So much more as you see the day approaching. The day capitalized, meaning, the end, meaning these things we're talking about. So as we get near to the end, it's all the more reason why we're supposed to be together and why we're supposed to be exhorting each other. So be here, be in church, be at church online, be aware. And then second and finally, be awake. Do be awake. Verse 28 says, "Now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and put forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So you also, when you see these things happening, know that it is near, at the doors. Assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away." So we talked a little bit about some of this already, but just this week, we were talking about, when does Hallmark start showing Christmas movies? And we discovered that Hallmark Countdown to Christmas begins on Friday, October 21st. So it's right around the corner. But the thing is, it's just like when you go to Starbucks and they have the Christmas cups. When you turn on the Hallmark channel and they're showing the Christmas movies, like you know that the holidays are near. And Jesus' whole point is that when you see these general signs increasing in severity and frequency, and certainly when you see these specific signs, know that the end is near. And so in verse 32, but of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. Take heed, watch and pray, for you do not know when the time is. It is like a man going to a far country who left his house and gave authority to his servants and to each his work, and commanded the doorkeeper to watch. Watch therefore, for you do not know when the master of the house is coming, in the evening, at midnight, at the crowing of the rooster, or in the morning, lest coming suddenly he find you sleeping. And what I say to you, I say to all, watch. Now, you notice that word but in verse 32. It takes us all the way back to the questions in verse 14. They wanted to know, when is this stuff going to happen? And basically, Jesus says it's on a need-to-know basis, and you don't need to know. We need to know that he's coming. We don't need to know exactly when. And, Jesus here on earth willingly chose to forego his omniscience about that. So, obviously, date setting is foolish. We could talk a lot about that. We won't. I'll just say that date setting is foolish. But notice the word watch 4 times in 5 verses. Not always the same Greek word, but when Jesus gives that final command to watch, Jesus is using a word that it has the Greek word for sleep, and then it has the negative article in front of it, a prefix that negates it. So the idea is, don't sleep, be awake. That's the command, be awake. We have sayings like, to not be asleep at the switch, or not be asleep at the wheel, or to not be caught napping. That's what Jesus is saying, be awake. Mark 13 should be like spiritual espresso. After studying this, we should be spiritually caffeinated. So if we're supposed to be aware and we're supposed to be awake, how are those things different? Aware has to do with information. Awake has to do with transformation. Aware has to do with input. Awake has to do with output. Aware has to do with what I take in. Awake has to do with what I give out. We need to wake up. We need to be awake. We need to wake up and pray. Verse 33. Remember how in the Lord's Prayer, part of what we're supposed to say is, your kingdom come. So when it comes to praying, come soon back to earth, we need to pray the prayers. When it comes to praying, pray now to my heart, we need to pray the prayers. When it comes to praying, come now to the hearts of other people, we need to pray the prayers. And in addition to waking up and praying, we need to wake up and work. Verse 34. In John 9, verse 4, Jesus said, I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no one can work. So we're not talking about working for salvation. We're talking about taking advantage of the opportunities that God has given us while we have them. When it comes to those opportunities that God's given us with our family, we need to work the works. When it comes to those opportunities God has given us with friends, we need to work the works. When it comes to those opportunities that God has given us at church and on the job and in the classroom, we need to work the works. I love it in 1 John 2, verse 28, where it says, now little children, abide in him, that when he appears, we may have confidence and not be ashamed before him at his coming. Listen to it again from the Message. And now, children, stay with Christ. Live deeply in Christ. Then we'll be ready for him when he appears, ready to receive him with open arms, and with no cause for red-faced guilt or lame excuses when he arrives. What to do? We do want to be aware and awake. So, gosh, remember all the way back in verse 2, the thing that Jesus said that prompted the questions was that the temple would be destroyed. He said that not one stone would be left upon another. Do you know that Josephus tells us that that's exactly what happened? Josephus tells us that when the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, that the Romans set it on fire. Remember the gold plates? As the temple burned, the gold melted and it went down into the bricks. The brick walls were like Legos. You know what I mean? They were shaped to fit together. And so when the gold melted, it went into all the spaces in between these bricks, these stones. And so what happened as a result was that it was dismantled stone by stone later to get all the gold out. When you visit today, when you go to the Temple Mount, as I've done, you'll see the Wailing Wall. And certainly there are still stones at the Wailing Wall, but that Wailing Wall is simply a retention wall for the Mount. When it comes to the temple itself, not one stone was left upon another. In other words, it happened exactly the way Jesus said it would. And in just that same way, everything else that Jesus tells us. If everything he told us about 70 AD came true, then everything that he tells us about those events that are still future will come true as well. And so, are we near the end? I don't know. Every generation of Christ follower has thought that they were near the end. I've lived decades thinking that Jesus could come at any moment, and I still think that. I still think that he could, but I don't know if he will. So as we think about all of this, what should we not do? Well, we should not be deceived. We should not be afraid. We should not worry. What should we do? We should be aware, and we should be awake. Father, sections like this are so much fun to study, and we just have to approach it with humility, realizing that there are lots of different takes on what these verses mean. That historically, Christians have understood them in different ways. So help us to be humble, Lord. Humble enough to say that we might not be right about all of this. We might be wrong about some of this. But in that spirit of humility, may we also apply ourselves and make an effort to understand these things. And as we understand them, to be moved by the things that Jesus encouraged us not to do and the things that he encouraged us to do. Lord, I know that for many people, an overemphasis of these things has been traumatic. And we read about people that have a kind of PTSD from living with fear of being left behind, or living with, in the anticipation of grief over loved ones that would suffer and so forth. And Lord, it's not my intention to fuel those flames at all. I pray that in the place of anxiety, we would not be afraid, we would not worry, we would have peace. But I do pray that we would be aware, and I do pray that we would be awake. Lord, may we respond to this message by being spiritually awake as we go forward. Lord, knowing that we may live out our whole natural lives, and that many more generations may live out their whole natural lives before you interrupt history. But realizing that we always have to live with a sense of urgency, that whether we live our full natural life or whether we are the generation that sees you return, that we would have a sense of urgency about our life, just a healthy sense of wanting to make the most of every day, of every moment, to love you, to love people, to be in the center of your will, to allow you to work in us and through us for your glory. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.
So you're pretty brave, but I noticed you didn't say a return date. You didn't predict a return date for the second coming.
No, I'm going to stay as far away from date setting as I possibly can.
Come on now.
When I was in high school, we were sure that the rapture would happen before we could even graduate.
100%.
So, as you can see from looking at me, it's been quite some time since I graduated from high school. Jesus still hasn't come, so I'm just going to stay far away from date setting.
Your wisdom is showing. And we hope you enjoyed this online service. To learn more about Sola Church, you can go to solachurch.life.
And also just a reminder that we offer online small groups for those of you that aren't here on the west side and can't attend a small group in person. So for information about that, shoot us an email at info@solachurch.life.
And we hope you have a wonderful week, and we will see you next time at Sola Church Online.
Bye, everybody.